There was a moment when Conor McGregor wasn't just a fighter, he was the most electrifying figure in all of sports. A man who turned every arena from Las Vegas to New York into his personal stage and made the world believe nothing could break him. But behind the roar of the crowds, behind the record-shattering PPV numbers and the multi-million-dollar walkouts, there was another story unfolding, one the UFC never wanted anyone to look at closely. How does someone go from living on 188 euros a week in welfare to generating more than $100 million in a single night? How does a fighter rise so fast, crash so hard, and yet remain protected by an entire organization built on discipline and control? Something about that journey never added up, and as the spotlight grew brighter, the cracks around McGregor grew even deeper. His meteoric rise had all the markings of a phenomenon that shouldn't have been possible, powered by forces that operated far beyond the octagon. Forces that shaped his narrative, bent the rules, and rewrote the promotional playbook just to keep him on top. Yet none of that could stop what came next. Because once the chaos began, from the scandals to the legal battles to the moments the cameras weren't allowed to show, McGregor became a problem no one at UFC headquarters could fully contain. And that is where the truth hides, in the gap between the man they created and the man no one could control. To understand what really happened, we have to go back to the beginning, to the rise that never made sense. The rise of Conor McGregor was so fast, so loud, and so perfectly timed that it almost felt engineered, as if the universe and the UFC had quietly agreed to rewrite the rules for one man. Before the tailored suits, the private jets, and the record-breaking PPV headlines, McGregor was a fighter from Dublin, hustling through local circuits with a confidence so oversized it looked delusional to anyone who didn't understand what desperation can create. He lived with the weight of unpaid bills, family expectations, and the harsh reality of surviving on 188 euros a week. And yet, he spoke with the certainty of someone already holding a championship belt. When he entered the UFC in 2013, something unusual happened. The organization pushed him harder, louder, and faster than any newcomer in recent memory. Promotions that fighters worked years to earn were handed to him almost immediately. Press conferences were built around his voice, not his record. Fight nights were scheduled to spotlight his charisma, not his ranking. And every time he opened his mouth, ticket sales surged in ways the UFC hadn't seen in years. The real question was never whether McGregor would win. It was why the UFC needed him to. Behind closed doors, executives understood the numbers. They knew that McGregor wasn't just a fighter. He was a business model, a marketing engine disguised as an athlete. Someone who could sell out arenas before fans even knew who he was fighting. His rise aligned perfectly with the sport's transition into a new era dominated by broadcast deals, social media explosions, and a global audience hungry for a personality instead of a resume. McGregor delivered all of that with the force of a storm, and the UFC reacted by building his mythology faster than he could throw a left hand. But it wasn't just opportunity. It was protection. When injuries delayed his opponents, the schedule bent around him. When controversies sparked online, promotional footage overshadowed them. When other fighters begged for fair treatment, the organization turned the spotlight toward the man it knew could sell 1 million buys with a single sentence. Every layer of his rise carried a question the UFC never acknowledged. Why him, and why so fast? Because the truth is that a fighter like McGregor wasn't supposed to happen naturally. His ascent didn't follow the typical grind of contenders climbing step by step. It was an acceleration beyond logic, a narrative built on hype, calculation, and the belief that as long as he kept winning, the entire industry could rise with him. But momentum that moves too quickly can only hide the cracks for so long. And the first signs of those cracks would soon reveal a turning point the UFC spent years trying to control. Everything changed on the night of the infamous bus incident in 2018, a moment so chaotic and explosive that it instantly became one of the most shocking scenes in UFC history. Yet even then, the full truth of what happened and what it triggered never reached the public the way it should have. The images were everywhere. Conor McGregor, surrounded by his entourage, storming into the loading dock of the Barclays Center in Brooklyn, throwing a metal dolly through the window of a fighter bus carrying Khabib Nurmagomedov and several other athletes preparing for UFC 223. Shattered glass, injured fighters like Michael Chiesa and Ray Borg, fights canceled, lawsuits filed, and headlines exploding across every news outlet in the country. It looked like a career-ending moment, the kind of act that would get any other athlete suspended indefinitely, stripped of opportunities, and used as a public warning about consequences. But that's not what happened. Instead, the UFC moved in a way that raised more questions than answers. While the footage was undeniably damaging, the organization's reaction was surprisingly measured, even strategic. Publicly, they condemned the act, called it disgusting, and labeled it the lowest moment in the promotion's history. Privately, they were navigating an entirely different crisis. Their biggest moneymaker had just ignited a disaster on the eve of an event that was already struggling with last-minute card changes and disappointing ticket projections. McGregor wasn't just any fighter. He was the face of the company, the engine behind their largest PPV numbers, and the only man on the roster who could transform a tense situation into global media coverage within hours. And that's exactly what this incident did. The chaos overshadowed every other storyline surrounding the event, making UFC 223 a cultural moment rather than another card on the schedule. With that level of attention came leverage, and with leverage came protection. The UFC didn't bury McGregor, they repositioned him. They turned the narrative into a personal feud, a grudge match that could be monetized at a scale the sport had never seen. They walked a fine line between condemning the action and fueling the fire that would eventually lead to the McGregor versus Khabib showdown, a fight that would become the highest-selling PPV in UFC history, with an estimated 2.4 million buys. But behind the scenes, the consequences were real and far more damaging than the UFC publicly admitted. The lawsuits from the bus incident lingered long after the headlines faded, costing millions in settlements and legal fees. Sponsors grew uneasy, with several brands quietly distancing themselves from McGregor and internally questioning whether the UFC could continue treating one fighter like he was untouchable. The organization knew the truth. The incident wasn't just a scandal. It was a sign that McGregor's world was spinning out of control faster than they could manage. Yet they pushed forward anyway, consumed by the revenue and attention his presence generated. The bus attack was more than a violent outburst. It was the moment where the UFC's dependency on one man became impossible to hide. It set in motion a chain of events that would reshape McGregor's career, fracture his relationship with the organization, and expose the dangerous line between a fighter who sells fights and a fighter who becomes bigger than the sport itself. And as the world watched the chaos unfold, very few realized that this was only the beginning of a downfall, that money, fame, and even the UFC machine would no longer be able to stop. To understand what really happened to Conor McGregor, you have to follow the money, the numbers that were whispered behind closed doors, the deals that never appeared in press releases, and the financial dependency the UFC never wanted anyone to examine too closely. On paper, McGregor was simply the promotion's biggest star, a fighter who broke records with charisma and precision. But the truth was far more complicated. McGregor wasn't just another athlete on the roster. He was the financial engine pulling the entire organization forward, especially during a critical period when the UFC was negotiating major broadcasting contracts, expanding into new markets, and proving its value after being purchased for $4 billion by WME IMG in 2016. Every piece of that puzzle revolved around pay-per-view revenue, and McGregor dominated that arena like no one in the company's history. His fight with Nate Diaz, then his rematch, then the mega fight against Floyd Mayweather in 2017, which reportedly generated more than $600 million in combined revenue, pushed him into a category where the UFC could no longer afford to treat him like an ordinary employee. And that's where things became more hidden. While the UFC publicly insisted that all fighters were treated fairly, insiders knew McGregor had arrangements that blurred the line between athlete and partner. Preferential revenue splits, promotional privileges, and layers of influence that no other fighter came close to receiving. His bout against Khabib Nurmagomedov in 2018 set a new standard with an estimated 2.4 million PPV buys, a number so massive that it became a cornerstone of the UFC's pitch to networks like ESPN during negotiations for the historic multi-year broadcast deal. Without McGregor, those numbers wouldn't have existed. Without those numbers, the deal would never have been worth as much. That's why, even as scandals piled up and the legal issues mounted, the UFC shielded him. They had to, because McGregor didn't just sell fights, he sold the future. But the money didn't just lift him higher, it pulled him into a world where control slipped through everyone's fingers, including his own. His reported earnings from the Mayweather fight, over $100 million, combined with his explosive rise in endorsement deals from brands like Monster, Reebok, and Burger King, created a financial whirlwind that few athletes in combat sports history had ever seen. Then came Proper 12, the whiskey brand McGregor launched in 2018, which skyrocketed into a global phenomenon, eventually selling a significant stake for a reported $150 million. That deal alone transformed him from a fighter into a mogul, someone with financial power that rivaled the very organization promoting him. But with that power came unpredictability. The UFC found itself in a paradoxical position. McGregor was their most valuable asset and their most dangerous liability. Every scandal threatened sponsors. Every delay jeopardized events. Every legal case risked damaging relationships with broadcasters who now expected consistent blockbuster numbers. Yet the UFC had placed themselves in a corner they couldn't escape. They had built a system where one man carried the weight of $1 billion machine. And once that machine leaned too heavily on him, there was no going back. The money they never wanted the public to fully understand wasn't just about earnings. It was about dependence, a lopsided dynamic that made the UFC hesitant to enforce consequences and increasingly desperate to manage McGregor's spiraling world. And as the revenue grew larger, so did the cracks in the foundation, setting the stage for a personal collapse that nobody, the UFC, the fans, or McGregor himself, was prepared to face next. The public collapse of Conor McGregor didn't happen overnight, and it didn't unfold in a way that fans could easily see. Instead, it crept into his life through late-night chaos, the weight of unimaginable wealth, and a lifestyle that even the most disciplined athlete would struggle to control. The cameras captured him walking into arenas in designer suits and stepping out of private jets, but they never showed the nights where the bills for a single evening surpassed $100,000, where entourages grew larger, where every room he entered depended on his energy, his unpredictability, and the storm that followed him. The truth behind McGregor's downfall was not just scandal, it was exhaustion, fame at a scale that human beings aren't built to withstand, and the pressure of being the only fighter in UFC history who had become bigger than the promotion itself. As allegations surfaced, bar incidents in Dublin, altercations caught on shaky phone footage, lawsuits that filled courtrooms and headlines, the pattern was clear. McGregor was unraveling from the inside. But what made this period so destructive was not just the behavior itself, it was how the UFC managed it. Every reported altercation became a negotiation. Every legal issue, a quiet strategy session. Every public misstep, a brand management emergency. The UFC found itself navigating a fighter whose influence overshadowed the very structure built to control athletes, and the organization's hesitation to impose true consequences only intensified McGregor's sense of invincibility. Fame had reshaped him. The man who once shadowboxed in a cramped gym in Crumlin was now surrounded by walls of security. endless party invitations, and a global audience expecting him to be outrageous every time he opened his mouth. His confidence, once an asset, became a burden, amplified by millions of followers and a constant cycle of validation. Meanwhile, whispers circulated through the fight world about his mental state, his training habits, and the toll of trying to maintain a character the world demanded while privately struggling with the consequences of living like a myth rather than a man. His performances inside the octagon reflected the shift. The sharpness dulled. The hunger faded. The discipline that once defined him was replaced with the unpredictability that made him too difficult for the UFC to manage, yet too valuable to lose. The organization needed him to stay focused, controlled, and promotable, but McGregor's world was becoming too chaotic to contain. Then came the losses, first to Khabib Nurmagomedov, then the 2 defeats to Dustin Poirier, each fight exposing deeper fractures in his preparation, commitment, and emotional stability. The devastating leg break in 2021 symbolized more than physical injury. It marked the moment when McGregor's armor cracked in front of millions, showing a fighter whose body could no longer carry the weight of his persona. The UFC tried to maintain the illusion that he would return stronger, but behind the scenes, executives quietly questioned whether the man they once built their empire around could ever reclaim the focus and discipline that made him a star. And yet, even as the scandals mounted and the losses accumulated, McGregor remained protected, promoted, and positioned for a comeback. Why? Because the UFC understood a truth they would never admit publicly. McGregor's chaos was damaging, but his absence would be far worse. The fallout of his personal collapse was no longer just about a fighter losing control. It was about an organization trapped between the myth they created and the reality they could no longer manage, setting the stage for the final reveal of how a man once unstoppable became a figure the UFC couldn't keep lifting forever. As Conor McGregor drifted further from the fighter he once was, another transformation unfolded, one that quietly shifted the balance of power inside the UFC and created a problem so large the organization never had a public answer for it. McGregor was no longer just an athlete or a promotional asset. He had evolved into a self-contained empire worth hundreds of millions, a man whose influence extended far beyond the octagon and into industries that the UFC had no leverage over. When he launched Proper 12 in 2018, few expected it to explode into a global whiskey phenomenon, but the brand surged past 300,000 cases in its first year, and later led to a reported $150 million sale of a majority stake. Combined with the money he made against Floyd Mayweather, his endorsements, and his sprawling business ventures, from the Black Forge Inn to the McGregor Fast Fitness brand, McGregor's net worth rose to a point where fighting became optional, and the UFC suddenly found itself in a position where their biggest star no longer needed them. This imbalance was unprecedented. For decades, the UFC controlled fighters through opportunity, financial dependency, and the promise of fame. But McGregor's empire freed him from that system. He could negotiate differently, speak differently, demand differently. Promoters privately admitted that he had become too big to control, and every attempt to shape his career turned into a tug of war between a corporate machine and a man who no longer answered to anyone. The organization wanted consistency, discipline, and marketable professionalism. But McGregor brought volatility, delays, and a public persona wrapped in chaos. They wanted him in training camps. He was in yachts. They wanted media tours. He was promoting liquor, opening businesses, and living across Ireland, Spain, and Las Vegas like a celebrity whose daily schedule no longer revolved around the octagon. And the deeper truth, one the UFC would never admit, was that they feared losing him more than they feared the consequences of enabling him. He had become a brand larger than their own marketing strategies, a fighter who sold millions of PPV buys, regardless of rankings or recent losses, someone whose presence on a fight card could raise the valuation of the entire company. Yet that same value came with a price. The delayed comebacks, the mounting controversies, the fractured relationships with other fighters, the growing frustration inside management, and the widening gap between McGregor's image and his actual performance created a fragile illusion the UFC struggled to maintain. His devastating loss to Dustin Poirier and the horrific leg break in July 2021 exposed the hardest truth. McGregor couldn't keep delivering the level of dominance his legend was built on. But instead of acknowledging the decline, the UFC leaned deeper into the myth, promoting potential comebacks, fueling speculation, and keeping his name alive in headlines, even when no fight was scheduled. They needed him to remain McGregor, even if the fighter behind that name was fading. In a sense, McGregor outgrew the UFC, and that growth cost him the discipline, hunger, and structure that once made him unstoppable. It also cost the UFC the ability to manage him the way they managed everyone else. The collapse wasn't about one fighter falling apart. It was about a company realizing it had built a superstar so large, so influential, and so financially powerful that the machine could no longer contain him. And the truth the UFC never admitted is that McGregor didn't just change the organization. He broke the system that created him, leaving both sides trapped between nostalgia for what he once was and uncertainty about what he will ever be again. In the end, the story of Conor McGregor is not simply the tale of a fighter who rose too fast or a celebrity who lost control. It's the story of a man who became so large, so profitable, and so culturally dominant that even the UFC, with its rules, contracts, and billion-dollar structure, could no longer shape him. He was the golden engine behind record-breaking PPV numbers, the charismatic storm who filled stadiums from Las Vegas to Dubai, and the unpredictable force who made every press conference feel like a spectacle bigger than the fight itself. Yet as the years passed and the controversies mounted, something became painfully clear. The man who once outran every opponent could no longer outrun himself. His empire grew, his fame expanded, and his life spiraled further from the discipline that built him into a champion, creating a version of McGregor the UFC didn't know how to control and the world didn't know how to understand. And so, the question remains, the one the UFC has never answered publicly and fans still whisper about today. What truly happened to the fighter who once looked invincible? Was it the wealth, the pressure, the chaos, or simply the weight of becoming larger than the sport that made him? Whatever the truth is, one fact is undeniable. Conor McGregor changed the UFC forever, and whether he returns to greatness or fades into legend, the impact of his rise and collapse will be felt long after the final bell has rung. Because stories like his don't just end, they echo, shaping everything that comes next.